Good evening and welcome back to Mr. Chill Chapters. Tonight we journey to a land that exists at the very edge of our world, a place of profound, almost alien beauty and a silence so deep it can feel like a living entity. We are going to the vast frozen wilderness of Alaska. This isn't just a place on a map, it's a territory that guards its secrets with a ferocity that has humbled generations. For every breathtaking glacier and majestic mountain peak, there is a shadow that stretches longer, a cold that seeps deeper, and a story that defies all attempts at rational explanation. We have gathered for you 10 of the most disturbing true horror stories from this unforgiving landscape. These are not campfire tales or urban legends. These are documented accounts, harrowing testimonies from the very people who stand as the last line of defense against the unknown. The emergency dispatchers who answer calls from the void. The seasoned researchers who uncover things that should have remained buried. The seasonal workers who trade their safety for a paycheck. And the bush pilots who see things in the endless sky that have no right to be there. Each story you are about to hear is a documented nightmare. A chilling chapter pulled from Alaska's most isolated corners. These are places where the extreme cold preserves more than just bodies, and the endless, oppressive darkness of the polar night conceals unspeakable truths. We have pieced these narratives together from official reports that were quietly filed away, from personal journals filled with frantic, terrified handwriting, and from recorded transmissions that were never, ever meant to see the light of day. If this is your first time venturing into the darkness with us, make sure to subscribe to Mr. Chill Chapters for your daily dose of true horror, meticulously researched and crafted to chill you to your very core. Hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss a single story when the Arctic winds begin to carry whispers of terror. Now take a deep breath. Let us venture together into the heart of Alaska's most disturbing mysteries, to a place where the frontier ends and your worst nightmares come alive in temperatures that can kill you in minutes. Story 1. The Dispatcher's Call. 3 years ago, I was working the graveyard shift as a dispatcher for the Alaska State Troopers, a job I'd held for 15 years. My name is Marcus. In my time, I've been the calm voice in the storm for people facing every imaginable horror. I've guided frantic callers through blizzards, talked down armed and desperate men, coordinated rescues for hikers who vanished into the white, and listened to the final ragged breaths of bear attack victims. I thought I was immune, that I had built a wall of professional detachment so thick that nothing could penetrate it. I was wrong. Nothing in my training, nothing in my 15 years of experience could have prepared me for the call that came through on the night of February 14th, 2022. It was the heart of a brutal Alaskan winter. The temperature hadn't climbed above minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 solid weeks. It was a deep, predatory cold, the kind that makes your teeth ache in their sockets and turns your breath into a cloud of sharp ice crystals before it even leaves your mouth. Most sensible people were locked down, huddled by their fires, so our call volume was unusually low. Just the occasional wellness check or a domestic disturbance from folks getting cabin fever. Then at precisely 2:47 a.m., my console lit up with an incoming emergency call. The first odd thing was the quality of the connection. Most calls from the remote territories came through a haze of static, with dropped signals or that hollow, echoing delay from a satellite link. This one was crystal clear, as if the person was calling from the office next door. I answered with standard protocol. Alaska State Troopers, this is Marcus. What is your emergency? The voice that answered was male, middle-aged, with a slight but distinct Russian accent. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if he were choosing each word with immense care. My name is Dmitry Volkov. I am calling to report my own death. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My mind immediately sorted it into a familiar category, a prank call, or more likely someone in the throes of a mental health crisis. The long, dark winter months were notorious for pushing people over the edge. "Sir, can you repeat that?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Are you saying you're injured or in danger?" "No," he replied, his voice a perfect monotone. "I am not injured. I am dead. I died 3 days ago in my cabin near Talkeetna. My body is still there. Someone needs to come and collect it before the wolves do." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. This was different. I started typing notes into our system, my fingers flying across the keys. "Okay, Dimitri, I need you to give me your exact location so we can send someone to help you." "Mile marker 47 on the Parks Highway," he recited as if reading from a map. "Then 12 miles east on the old mining road. The cabin with the blue metal roof. You cannot miss it. The smoke stopped coming from the chimney 3 days ago." While he spoke, I was running his name through our database. Dmitry Volkov. The name came up immediately. 73 years old, lived alone, no next of kin on file. And then I saw it. The detail that made the blood in my veins turn to slush. There was already a welfare check request filed by his neighbor 2 days prior. The reason? The neighbor hadn't seen smoke from Dimitri's chimney in several days and was worried because Dimitri never let his fire die during the winter. "Dimitri," I said, my voice a little tighter now, "we actually have a welfare check request for you." Your neighbor was concerned. "Are you at your cabin right now?" "I am at my cabin, yes," he confirmed, "but I am not alive. I had a heart attack while splitting firewood behind the house. I fell face down in the snow. The cold preserved my body, but my heart stopped beating 72 hours ago." The hair on my arms was standing straight up. His voice was so calm, so utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man reporting a noise complaint, not his own demise. "Dimitri, if you are speaking to me right now, then you are alive," I insisted, my training kicking in. "Heart attack victims can survive. You might be confused or disoriented. I am sending paramedics to check on you right away." "You do not understand," he said, and for the first time there was a hint of something in his voice, not emotion but a profound weariness. "I watched my own body die. I have been watching it for 3 days. The ravens found it this morning. They started with the eyes. I felt like I was going to be sick. I kept him talking, a grim dance of protocol and morbid curiosity while I coordinated with the patrol unit. They were 40 minutes out, battling the icy roads. "Dimitri, what do you see right now?" "I can see my body lying behind the cabin. The axe is still in my right hand. My face is purple and frozen. There is no breathing, no pulse. The snow around my head is stained red from where I hit the ground. My neighbor's dog came by yesterday. It sniffed around but would not come close. Animals know death. But if you can see your body," I pressed, my mind reeling, "where are you calling from?" "I am standing in my kitchen looking out the window. The phone is in my hand. You will not believe me until you see for yourself. That is why I am calling. Someone needs to know what happened. Before I cannot call anymore." "What do you mean you cannot call anymore?" "Each day I become more distant," he explained, his voice seeming to fade slightly. "Yesterday I could still feel the cold. Today I cannot. Tomorrow I do not think I will remember how to use the phone. This is my last chance to report this properly." The patrol unit radioed in. They had reached the mining road, 25 minutes out. I relayed this to Dimitri. "The officers are almost there. They are going to help you. They will find my body behind the cabin," he stated. "Tell them to look for the blue metal roof. Tell them I am sorry for the inconvenience." Then Officer Martinez's voice crackled over my radio, strained and urgent. Dispatch, we have a body behind the cabin, male, elderly, deceased for several days by the look of it. Definitely a cardiac event. We need the coroner out here. I looked at my phone. The call was still connected. The line was still active. Dimitri, I whispered into the receiver. Are you still there? Silence. Then a sound that will be etched into my memory until the day I die. It was breathing, but not human breathing. It was a wet, rattling, gurgling sound, like air being forced through a collapsed and fluid-filled windpipe. Then the line went dead. The officers on scene confirmed every single detail Dimitri had given me. The body was frozen solid, dead for at least 3 days. The axe was still gripped in his right hand. But here is the part that shattered my reality. The forensics team confirmed there was no power to the cabin. The generator had run out of fuel days ago, and the phone company, after a formal inquiry, confirmed that the landline to that property had been physically disconnected and out of service for almost a year, ever since a tree fell across the wires the previous winter. I stared at my console. The call had lasted 37 minutes. I had 47 screens of notes. The phone number that had called in did not exist. I never reported the full details of that conversation. Who would believe me? In my official log, I wrote that we received an anonymous tip about a welfare check. But I kept those notes. I still have them. 6 months later, I transferred to a different department. I couldn't take another night shift. But sometimes, when I'm driving past Talkeetna, I think about Dmitry Volkov. I wonder how many other voices are out there calling from phones that do not work, reporting deaths that have already happened, asking for a help that can never ever come. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, but I know Dmitry Volkov was just trying to do the right thing, even after death. He called to report his own passing, because that is what a responsible citizen does. Story 2. The Photographer and the Ice Ghosts. There are people who are drawn to Alaska for its raw, untamed beauty. And then there are people who are drawn to its soul-crushing hostility. My colleague Isabella Martinez belonged to the latter group. She was a wildlife photographer for National Geographic, but that title doesn't do her justice. She was more of a storm chaser, a hunter of impossible moments. While other photographers flocked to Alaska during the comfortable sun-drenched summer months, Isabella thrived in the dead of winter. She had a philosophy, one she repeated to me often over lukewarm coffee in our Fairbanks office. The cold, she would say, her eyes intense, brings out the truth in everything. The landscape, the animals, even the light itself, they can't lie when it's 50 below. Her portfolio was a testament to this belief. It was filled with haunting, almost ethereal images. A lone wolf, a phantom of gray fur moving through a blinding blizzard, a vast caribou migration across a frozen, wind-swept tundra, their breaths creating a ghostly river of steam. And the northern lights, not as a gentle curtain but as a violent electric storm reflecting off the fractured blue heart of a glacier. In December of 2021, Isabella approached me with a new obsession. She was planning a solo expedition to the Wrangell Mountains, one of the most remote and unforgiving ranges on the continent. She wanted to photograph a specific, almost mythical phenomenon that occurred only during the deepest, darkest part of winter, something she called ice ghosts. According to her research, these were not simple frost patterns. They were complex, almost architectural formations that appeared when supercooled moisture in the air crystallized instantaneously around certain objects during extreme cold snaps, creating what looked like frozen, life-sized apparitions. The location she had chosen was an abandoned mining camp about 60 miles northeast of McCarthy, a ghost town at the end of a long, treacherous road. The camp had been deserted since the 1940s, but Isabella, with her obsessive attention to detail, had studied historical weather data and determined it was the perfect crucible to capture her ice ghosts. She had rented a small rustic cabin from a local outfitter and planned to spend 2 weeks alone with her cameras and her thoughts. I advised against it strongly. I was her field guide and designated emergency contact, and my gut was screaming that this was a bad idea. The area was incredibly remote. Temperatures there regularly dropped to -50, a cold so profound it could freeze exposed skin in under a minute. Cell phone coverage was a fantasy, and even satellite communication could be unreliable. But Isabella was fiercely independent and meticulously prepared. She laid out her gear for me: professional-grade cold-weather photography equipment, a military-spec emergency beacon, enough dehydrated food and fuel for 3 weeks, and a state-of-the-art satellite communicator for our daily check-ins. We agreed on a strict protocol. She would send me a brief coded message every evening at exactly 8 p.m. All is well. If I didn't hear from her for more than 24 hours, I was to contact search and rescue immediately. No excuses, no delays. She flew out on December 15th with a bush pilot named Tom, a grizzled veteran who had seen it all. He dropped her at the cabin, a tiny speck of human endeavor in an endless sea of white, and watched as she unloaded her mountain of equipment. The first 3 days went exactly according to plan. Her messages were brief, but I could feel her excitement vibrating through the cold digital text. Day 1. Arrived safely. Cabin is solid. Temperature -32. Incredible conditions for shooting. All is well. Day 2. Got some amazing shots of ice formations around the old mining equipment. The light here is otherworldly. All is well. Day 3. Found something interesting near the mine entrance. Ice formations unlike anything I have seen before. Almost look sculpted, staying an extra day to document. All is well. On day 4, the rhythm broke. Her message didn't arrive at 8 p.m. I waited, my anxiety growing with each passing hour. Finally, at 11:17 p.m., a message came through. It was longer than usual, and the all is well was missing. Day 4. The formations are moving. I know that sounds impossible, but I have time-lapse footage that proves it. They shift position subtly. When I'm not looking directly at them. It's not melting or wind, it's deliberate. I was concerned, but not yet alarmed. Isabella was a scientist at heart, a rational observer. I reasoned that extreme cold and isolation could play tricks on the mind, even one as sharp as hers. Day 5. Her message came in the middle of the night. I was wrong about them being ice formations. They are not made of ice. I don't know what they are made of, but they are not natural. They appear in my photographs even when I cannot see them with my naked eyes. The camera is picking up something that isn't there. Now I was getting worried. This was moving beyond simple paranoia. I sent back a message. Isabella, do you need an early pickup? Just say the word. She did not respond. Day 6. They know I am photographing them. When I review my images, there are more of them in each shot. They are multiplying or getting closer. I cannot tell which. Day 7. I found photos on my camera that I did not take. The timestamps show they were taken while I was sleeping inside the cabin. Someone or something is using my equipment. I immediately called Tom, the pilot. I told him the situation was deteriorating and I needed a flyover of the cabin as soon as possible. The weather was turning, a storm was brewing on the horizon, but he agreed to check on her the moment the storm passed. Day 8. The photos taken while I slept show the inside of the cabin. They show me sleeping in my bunk, but they also show shapes standing around the bed. Tall, thin shapes. I cannot see these shapes with my eyes, only through the camera lens. They were watching me sleep. Day 9. I understand now. The camera sees what is really here. The ice ghosts are not ice, and they are not ghosts. They are something else entirely. Something that exists in a spectrum of light human eyes cannot perceive. This place is not empty. It's crowded. Tom was finally able to do a flyover on day 10. He radioed me from the air. He reported that the cabin looked normal. There was smoke coming from the chimney, and he could see Isabella's gear neatly arranged outside. There were no visible signs of distress, but the weather was still too rough for a landing. He had to turn back. Day 10. I have been reviewing all my photos from the trip. The shapes appear in every single image, even the ones taken on the first day. They were here before I arrived. I think they have always been here. Day 11. Last night I left the camera running with a motion trigger. This morning there were 847 new photos, all taken between midnight and 6 a.m. All showing the same thing, dozens of tall, thin, vaguely humanoid figures surrounding the cabin. Some appear to be looking through the windows. Others seem to be examining my equipment with an unnerving curiosity. I was done waiting. I was preparing to officially organize a ground rescue operation when her Day 12 message came through. The tone had shifted again from terror to a strange, unnerving sense of discovery. Day 12. I finally understand what they want. They want to be seen. They want to be documented. For decades, maybe centuries, they have been here, invisible to human eyes. I am the first person to bring equipment sensitive enough to capture them. Day 13. They are not hostile. They are curious. When I hold up printed photos of them, they seem to gather and examine the images. I think they have never seen themselves before. I am giving them what they have always wanted, proof that they exist. Her final message came on day 14. It was calm, resolute, and utterly terrifying. Day 14. I am staying longer than planned. This is the most important work I have ever done. These beings deserve to be documented properly. Tom does not need to pick me up yet. I will contact you when I am ready. That was the last communication I ever received from Isabella Martinez. When she didn't check in on day 15, I contacted Search and Rescue. It took another 2 agonizing days to organize a team and wait for a break in the weather. When we finally reached the cabin on day 17, we found a scene of quiet, clinical madness. Isabella was sitting at the small wooden table, surrounded by printed photographs. They covered every surface: the table, the floor, the walls. She was alive, but only in the most technical sense. She was in a deep catatonic state, her eyes wide and unfocused, staring at the images spread before her. Her camera equipment was still running, the shutter clicking automatically every few minutes, documenting the empty room. The photographs were the most disturbing thing I have ever seen. They showed the cabin interior filled with the tall, impossibly thin humanoid figures. They appeared to be made of the same crystalline, light-bending material as her ice ghosts, but they were clearly animate and intelligent. In some photos, they were touching her equipment with long, delicate fingers. In others, they appeared to be communicating with each other through gestures we couldn't comprehend. A few of the most recent shots showed them standing directly beside Isabella as she worked. Close enough to touch her, their featureless heads tilted as if in study. The medical team said she was suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration, but that didn't explain her core condition. Her body temperature was impossibly low, far too low for human survival, yet her heart was still beating, a faint, irregular pulse of only 12 beats per minute. We evacuated her to Anchorage General Hospital. She remained in that same catatonic state for 6 weeks. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, and barely responded to stimuli. When she finally spoke, her first words whispered to a nurse were, "They are still here." They followed me. Isabella claimed the beings from her photographs had attached themselves to her. She said she could see them constantly now, without the aid of a camera. She insisted they were not harmful, just intensely curious about human civilization. The doctors diagnosed her with severe PTSD and cold-induced psychosis. But I saw those photographs. I saw how her equipment, even in the sterile hospital room, continued taking pictures of empty spaces that, when developed, were not empty at all. Isabella was never the same. She was released from the hospital after 3 months and became obsessed with photographing the most mundane locations: parking lots, office buildings, shopping centers, claiming she was documenting the others as they explored human environments. Her final exhibition before she disappeared for good was called The Invisible Migration. It consisted of hundreds of photographs of everyday life in Anchorage, all showing the same tall, crystalline figures moving silently through our world, unseen. Isabella vanished in September 2022. Her apartment was found empty except for her camera equipment and thousands upon thousands of photographs. The final images on her camera showed her own bedroom. She was not in the shots. Instead, the crystalline beings filled the frame, and they appeared to be looking directly at the camera, as if posing for a final, triumphant group portrait. The police classified it as a missing person case. But I know better. I think Isabella finally went where she belonged, somewhere between the visible world and whatever spectrum of light those beings inhabit. I kept one of her photographs. It shows a normal coffee shop in downtown Anchorage, but if you look carefully, in the reflection of the window, you can see them. Tall, thin, watching everything with an intelligence that makes your skin crawl. Sometimes I wonder if bringing that photograph home was a mistake. Because lately in my peripheral vision, I swear I can see shapes that shouldn't be there. Story 3. The cannery that preserves more than fish. Every summer, a silent migration occurs. Thousands of desperate, hopeful workers journey north to Alaska's sprawling fishing industry, lured by the promise of quick, substantial money. Rashid Hassan was one of them. He thought it would be a simple transaction: 6 months of grueling, back-breaking labor in exchange for enough cash to pay off his crippling student loans and maybe, just maybe, start fresh somewhere else. The recruitment poster he'd seen at a dreary Seattle job center had made it sound almost glamorous. Work in America's last frontier, excellent pay, housing provided. It was a siren song for the young and indebted. What the glossy poster didn't tell him was that the cannery, Fish Point, sat on a remote, God-forsaken island 40 miles from the nearest town, a place accessible only by a company-owned boat or a prohibitively expensive helicopter. What it definitely didn't mention, in any of its fine print, was that some of the workers who went to Fish Point Cannery never came back. Rashid Hassan was 24 years old, fresh out of college with an engineering degree that, in the harsh reality of the job market, had landed him nothing better than part-time work at an auto parts store. He was drowning in debt and suffocating from a sense of failure. When the cannery recruiter, a man with a too-wide smile and eyes that never seemed to blink, promised $12 an hour plus overtime, more money than Rashid had ever made in his life, he signed the 6-month contract without a second thought. His journey began on June 1st, 2020. The first red flag should have been the boat ride from Kodiak Island. The captain, a weathered, silent man named Murphy, barely spoke a word during the entire 2-hour journey across the choppy, slate-gray water. When Rashid, trying to be friendly, asked about the work, Murphy just shook his head, a grim, final gesture, and muttered, "You'll see soon enough." The only other passengers were 3 experienced cannery workers returning from a rare shore leave. They spent the entire trip huddled together, passing a bottle of cheap whiskey between them, occasionally glancing at Rashid with an expression that looked unnervingly like pity. Fish Point Cannery was bigger than Rashid had imagined. A sprawling, rusting complex of industrial buildings, bleak storage facilities, and long, low-slung dormitories clustered around a natural harbor. The main processing plant, a massive corrugated metal structure, seemed to vibrate with a constant low-frequency mechanical hum, a sound that you felt in your bones more than you heard with your ears. Smokestacks belched thick, greasy steam into the perpetually gray sky, and the air carried an overwhelming, multi-layered stench. The sharp, metallic smell of fish, the acrid tang of diesel fuel, and something else, something cloyingly sweet and faintly rotten that Rashid couldn't quite identify. The dormitory he was assigned to was a long, narrow building that felt more like a barracks or a prison block. It was filled with rows upon rows of metal bunk beds. Each worker was allotted a bunk, top or bottom, and a small dented metal locker. That was it. The mattresses were thin, stained with the ghosts of past occupants, and the entire building reeked of industrial disinfectant, desperately trying and failing to mask the smell of sweat and despair. Rashid's bunkmate was a Filipino man named Eduardo, whose tired eyes and deeply lined face told a story of many hard seasons. He had worked at Fish Point for 5 summers. "First time?" Eduardo asked, his voice raspy as Rashid unpacked his meager belongings. "Yeah. You?" Eduardo let out a short, humorless laugh. "I keep coming back. The money is good, but every year I tell myself it will be my last." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This place, it changes people, changes them in ways that don't wash off when you go home." Before Rashid could ask what he meant, a harsh electric buzzer, a sound like a tortured nerve, echoed through the complex. It was the dinner bell. It was the dinner. Eduardo explained that all meals were served in the mess hall at specific, non-negotiable times. Missing a meal meant going hungry until the next scheduled feeding. The mess hall was a cavernous, soulless room filled with long, splintered tables and benches, reinforcing the prison-like atmosphere. The food was institutional slop, overcooked watery vegetables, a gray, processed meat patty of indeterminate origin, and bread that tasted like cardboard. But Rashid was hungry from the journey and ate everything on his tray, trying not to think about it. He noticed that many of the workers ate mechanically, their eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, barely speaking to one another. They moved with a lethargic, defeated energy. "How many people work here?" Rashid asked Eduardo, trying to break the oppressive silence. "Hard to say. The count, it changes," Eduardo replied cryptically. He gestured with his chin toward a table in the far corner of the room. "See that table? Those are the guys who work the night shift in Processing Unit C. They don't talk to anyone. They sleep during their breaks. Some of them have been here 3-4 seasons, and I've never heard them say a single word." Rashid followed Eduardo's gaze. 6 men sat in complete, unnerving silence, eating their food with a robotic, unnatural efficiency. Their clothes were stained with what looked like fish blood, but the stains were a dark, rusty brown, almost black. When one of them happened to look up, Rashid saw that the man's eyes were completely bloodshot, the sclera a web of angry red veins, as if he hadn't slept in weeks. "What do they do in Processing Unit C?" Rashid whispered. "Special projects," Eduardo said, his voice barely audible over the din. "Company pays them double, but they have to sign extra paperwork, non-disclosure agreements, some kind of experimental processing technique they're developing." The orientation meeting after dinner was brief and to the point. The plant manager, a thin, severe man named Stevens with eyes like chips of ice, explained the basic safety protocols and work schedules. Most new workers, including Rashid, would be assigned to the main processing line, where they would clean, cut, and package salmon for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The 7th day was technically a rest day, but voluntary overtime was always available. Stevens also laid out the company's strict policies about leaving the island. No one was permitted to take boats or helicopters without explicit authorization. Any unauthorized attempt to leave would result in immediate termination and, more importantly, the complete forfeiture of all earned wages. It was a perfectly legal cage. A young woman near the front raised her hand. "What about communication with our families? Is there cell service?" "No cell towers out here," Stevens said flatly. "We have a satellite phone in the office for verified emergencies. Personal calls are limited to 5 minutes, once per week." Company policy. A chill went down Rashid's spine. He hadn't realized just how completely isolated they would be. 6 months without regular contact with the outside world suddenly seemed like a lifetime. Work began at 4 a.m. the next morning. Rashid was assigned to the gutting station. His job was to remove the internal organs from salmon as they moved down a constantly running conveyor belt. The work was exactly as horrible as it sounded, a relentless assault on the senses. Standing for 12 hours, performing the same gruesome, repetitive motions hundreds, thousands of times. He was perpetually covered in a slick, cold film of fish blood and slime. The noise of the machinery was a constant, deafening roar. And the smell. It was overwhelming. Not just fish, but the sharp chemical odor of the industrial cleaners and, underneath it all, that same sweet, rotting odor he had noticed when he first arrived. After just 3 days, Rashid's hands were raw and cracked despite the thick rubber gloves, and his back was a constant, screaming ache. But the worst part wasn't the physical toll. It was the other workers. Many of them seemed to exist in a kind of trance, performing their jobs with a terrifying mechanical precision, but showing no awareness of their surroundings. They rarely spoke, and they never ever made eye contact. "How long have some of these people been here?" Rashid asked Eduardo during their brief lunch break. "Some of them, years," Eduardo said, his gaze distant. "The company offers big bonuses to workers who sign multi-year contracts." But after a while, he trailed off, shaking his head. "After a while, what?" Rashid pressed. "Look at Martinez over there." Eduardo nodded toward a man working at the cleaning station. "He's been here 4 years. Just watch how he moves." Rashid observed Martinez. The man worked with an incredible, inhuman efficiency. His hands moved in a perfect fluid rhythm, never a wasted motion. But there was something deeply unsettling about it. He never looked up, never paused, never seemed to breathe hard despite the intense physical demands of the work. It was like watching a machine, an automaton made of flesh and bone. "It's like he's not really here," Rashid said. "Exactly," Eduardo whispered. "The company calls it optimal workforce integration. They say the best workers eventually achieve a state where the job becomes automatic, instinctive. They can work longer shifts, need fewer breaks, make fewer mistakes." "That doesn't sound normal." "Nothing about this place is normal," Eduardo said grimly. "But the company pays well and people need the money." On his 10th day, Rashid was pulled off the main line. Stevens informed him he was being reassigned to help with a special project in Processing Unit C. The pay would be double his regular wage, but he would have to sign additional confidentiality agreements. The paperwork was extensive, pages of dense legal language about trade secrets, proprietary techniques, and severe penalties for discussing company operations. Rashid hesitated, a knot of dread in his stomach. But the thought of that extra money, of paying off his loans that much faster, was too tempting. He signed everything without reading it carefully. Processing Unit C was in a separate, windowless building. The interior was starkly different from the main plant, cleaner, more modern, with equipment that looked like it belonged in a high-tech laboratory. The lighting was a harsh, sterile white that bleached all color from the room. The night shift supervisor, a woman named Dr. Reeves, with a cold, clinical demeanor, explained that they were testing a new preservation technique. The work involved injecting salmon with a special solution before processing. "What kind of solution?" Rashid asked. "Proprietary formulation, doctor." Reeves replied, her eyes unreadable. "Company developed. Extends shelf life. Improves texture." The solution was clear like water but had a sharp chemical smell that reminded Rashid of formaldehyde. The workers handling the injections wore full hazmat suits with respirators, which seemed like an extreme precaution for a food additive. The strangest part was what happened to the fish after injection. Within minutes, their natural silver-pink color faded to a ghastly, translucent gray-white. Their flesh became firm, almost rubbery. Dr. Reeves insisted this was a normal part of the process. During his third night in Unit C, Rashid made a discovery that shattered his world. He was in the cold storage area when he noticed some containers were labeled with dates from previous years, 2018, 2019. On a morbid impulse, he opened one of the older containers. The fish inside looked exactly the same as the ones processed that night. No decay, no smell of spoilage, but that wasn't the most disturbing part. When Rashid lifted one of the 2-year-old fish, it felt warm to the touch. Not room temperature, but body temperature. And as he stared, his heart pounding, he could swear he saw the gills flutter, a faint, ghostly movement. He dropped the fish and stumbled back. Looking around, he saw that all the fish in the older containers seemed to be subtly shifting, not swimming, but twitching, as if dreaming. Dr. Reeves found him there. "Problem?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Some of these are really old," Rashid stammered. "Are they still good?" "The solution prevents normal decomposition," she said, her eyes narrowing. "They could remain fresh indefinitely. But you shouldn't be handling the older samples. The compound becomes more concentrated over time." "What exactly is in that solution?" Dr. Reeves studied him for a long, unnerving moment. "I think it's time you met with Mr. Stevens about a permanent position here. You show real aptitude for this work." The next day in Stevens's office, the truth was laid bare. Fish Point was a research facility, testing advanced preservation techniques for government and military contracts. The salmon operation was just a cover. "We need dedicated personnel who can maintain absolute secrecy," Stevens said, his voice smooth as oil. "In exchange, we offer exceptional compensation." Rashid asked what would happen if he declined. Stevens smiled, a cold, dead thing. "No one declines. Once you've seen what you've seen, you become part of the family here. We take care of our family. But we also expect loyalty." That night, Rashid tried to leave. He made it to the harbor before Murphy and 2 other men found him. They gently but firmly escorted him back to the dormitory. Eduardo was waiting. "I tried to warn you," Eduardo said, his face etched with resignation. "How long have you really been here?" Rashid asked, his voice a whisper. 7 years, Eduardo admitted. "I stopped counting after the 5th. The preservation solution, and it doesn't just work on fish." Rashid felt his blood turn to ice. "What do you mean?" "The workers who've been here the longest," Eduardo explained, his voice hollow. "They inject themselves with it. It keeps them healthy, stops the aging, eliminates the need for sleep. But it also changes them, makes them less human. That's impossible." "Look at your hands," Eduardo said. Rashid looked down. His hands, which had been raw and bleeding, were completely healed, the skin smooth. He realized he'd been feeling stronger, more energetic, despite the grueling shifts. "They've been putting it in the food," Eduardo continued. "Small doses, just enough to improve performance. But once it's in your system, you need more and more, until you can't survive without it. The horrifying truth crashed down on Rashid. The silent workers, the mechanical movements, the lack of fatigue. They weren't just dedicated employees, they were something else. "Why do you stay?" Rashid whispered, his throat tight with terror. "Because if I try to leave, I will die," Eduardo said, his eyes empty. "The compound creates a dependency. Without it, my organs will shut down. I am trapped here until I become like the others. A perfect worker who never questions, never complains, and never remembers what life was like before." Rashid spent his remaining weeks at Fish Point in a daze, secretly documenting everything. But as the days passed, he found it harder to care about escape. The work became easier. He needed less sleep. He felt less pain. The compound was doing its job. The last entry in his hidden notes, the handwriting becoming unnervingly neat and uniform, read, "Week 23, I understand now. This is not imprisonment. This is evolution. We are becoming something better. Something that can work forever without fatigue, without the weakness of emotion. The company is not just preserving fish. They are preserving us. And preservation is just another word for immortality." Official records show that Rashid Hassan completed his contract and signed on for a permanent position. He's been there for 5 years now, working the night shift in Processing Unit C. He never takes vacation, he never calls home, and according to his co-workers, he never seems to age. Because some jobs don't just change you, they consume you. And in the remote corners of Alaska, some companies have discovered that the most valuable resource isn't the fish they catch, but the workers they preserve. Story 4. The Pilot and the Confusion Zone. In the tight-knit community of Alaskan bush pilots, Kenji Nakamura was a living legend. He was the kind of pilot everyone, from grizzled prospectors to high-ranking government officials, trusted with their lives without a second thought. For 20 years, he had flown Alaska's most dangerous and unforgiving routes, the so-called milk runs that were anything but routine. He delivered critical supplies to remote indigenous villages cut off by winter, conducted harrowing search and rescue operations in whiteout conditions, and transported researchers to locations so inaccessible that even helicopters couldn't land safely. His reputation was built on 3 pillars: surgical precision, obsessive caution, and an almost supernatural ability to read the fickle Alaskan weather, which could change from flyable to lethal in the span of a single breath. I knew Kenji personally, and I can attest to his legend. My name is Frank, and for the better part of those 20 years I worked as a flight dispatcher for Arctic Airways out of Fairbanks. Part of my job was to be the voice on the other end of the radio, coordinating flight plans, monitoring a constant stream of weather reports, and maintaining contact with our pilots as they navigated the vast, empty skies. In all my years of dispatching, I had never once worried about Kenji Nakamura. He was the gold standard. He was the pilot other pilots called for advice when conditions were too dangerous for anyone else. Kenji flew a modified Cessna 180, a plane he had personally maintained and upgraded over 15 years until it was less a machine and more an extension of his own body. He knew every bolt, every wire, every instrument in that aircraft better than most people know their own cars. He called it Kumo, the Japanese word for cloud. The plane was a fortress of preparedness, equipped with the latest GPS navigation, a military-grade emergency locator beacon, a robust satellite communication system, and enough survival gear to last 2 weeks in the harshest wilderness. If any pilot could handle an emergency in Alaska's backcountry, it was Kenji. On March 8, 2023, Kenji was contracted for what should have been a routine charter flight. A geological survey team from the University of Alaska needed transportation from Fairbanks to a remote location near Lake Clark National Park, approximately 280 miles southwest. The passengers were Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a brilliant and respected geologist, and her eager graduate assistant Mark Stevens. They were conducting research on dormant volcanic activity in the area and had booked a simple round trip with an overnight camp. The weather forecast was perfect, a rare gift in the Alaskan spring. Clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. I approved the flight plan without a moment's hesitation. Kenji's route was standard. He would fly southwest from Fairbanks following the majestic snow-capped spine of the Alaska Range, then turn south toward Lake Clark. Total flight time was estimated at 2 hours and 15 minutes each way. Kenji departed Fairbanks at 8:30 a.m. sharp, his 2 passengers and their geological equipment securely stowed. His first radio check-in came at 9:15 a.m., exactly on schedule. His voice was calm and professional. Fairbanks Dispatch, this is November 27 Echo Kilo. All conditions normal on course, no issues with aircraft systems. I could hear Dr. Mitchell in the background, her voice filled with awe, commenting on the spectacular mountain views. The second radio check at 10 a.m. was equally routine. Fairbanks Dispatch Echo Kilo passing the halfway point, aircraft performing beautifully, passengers are doing well. Estimating arrival at the landing site at 10:45 as planned. At 10:30 a.m., I received Kenji's final scheduled radio transmission before landing. His voice was still calm, but there was a new note in it, a subtle undercurrent of puzzlement that made me lean closer to my console. Fairbanks Dispatch, this is November 27 Echo Kilo. We are approximately 15 minutes from the landing site. Aircraft systems are normal, but I am seeing some unusual activity on the ground below. Copy Echo Kilo, I replied. What kind of activity? A large group of animals moving in formation, he said, a slight hesitation in his voice. Too organized to be natural. Could be a caribou herd, but the pattern is strange, almost like they are being directed by something. Roger that. Are you having any difficulty with navigation or aircraft systems? Negative. All systems green. GPS shows us on course. It's just, the animal behavior is unusual. I've never seen wildlife move in such precise formations. Copy that, Echo Kilo. Contact me when you are safely on the ground. Will do. Echo Kilo out. That was the last transmission anyone ever received from Kenji Nakamura. When he failed to check in by 11:30 a.m., I began standard overdue aircraft procedures. My initial calm slowly eroded into a cold, creeping dread. I contacted the geological team's emergency contact. They had heard nothing. Weather conditions remained crystal clear throughout the flight area. No other aircraft had reported seeing Kenji's plane. By 2 p.m., we had launched a full-scale search and rescue operation. The search continued for 2 days. The emergency locator beacon in Kenji's plane, a device designed to activate automatically upon impact, remained stubbornly silent. On the 3rd day, one of the search, helicopters spotted wreckage. It was in a deep, narrow valley approximately 12 miles from Kenji's intended destination, a place accessible only by helicopter. The recovery team found the remains of Kenji's Cessna, but the crash scene raised more questions than it answered. The aircraft had impacted the ground nose first at a steep angle, suggesting a controlled descent rather than an out-of-control crash. But several aspects of the scene defied all explanation. First, there was no debris trail. Aircraft don't just fall out of the sky. When they crash in mountainous terrain, they leave a scar, a path of scattered parts. Kenji's plane appeared to have dropped straight down into the clearing, as if placed there by an invisible hand. Second, the emergency locator beacon was found intact and fully functional. It should have screamed a distress signal the moment of impact. yet it had remained silent. When tested on site, it worked perfectly. Most disturbing was the condition of the aircraft's instruments. The GPS unit showed Kenji's last recorded position as being 47 miles north of the actual crash site. The altimeter was frozen at 12,000 feet, though the crash site was at 3,200 feet. The fuel gauges indicated full tanks, an impossibility. It was as if the plane had crashed in one reality, while its instruments were recording another. The bodies of all three occupants were recovered. The medical examiner determined they had died from injuries consistent with the impact. But the toxicology reports revealed something unprecedented. All three victims had blood oxygen levels that were impossible for the altitude. Their blood was saturated with oxygen concentrations typical of someone breathing pure O2 at sea level. The final chilling piece of the puzzle came from the flight data recorder. Kenji's plane wasn't required to carry one, but he had installed a basic cockpit voice recorder for his own training purposes. When we retrieved and analyzed the recording, we found 90 minutes of normal flight conversation, followed by 17 minutes of audio that should not exist. The recording captured Kenji's voice during the final approach. But instead of a routine landing, the audio revealed a man in a state of complete confusion and growing panic. "Sarah, are you seeing this?" Kenji's voice tight with disbelief. "The landing site has changed. There are structures down there that were not on the survey maps." Dr. Mitchell's voice strained. "What kind of structures?" "They look like buildings, but the architecture is wrong. Too tall, too narrow. And there are lights moving between them, but not electric lights." "Something else." Mark Stevens, the assistant, his voice trembling. "Kenji, maybe we should find an alternate landing site." "I'm trying," Kenji replied, his voice frantic now. "But the GPS is malfunctioning. It shows us at our destination, but this is not the location we plan to land. The terrain is completely different." The recording continued with Kenji's increasingly desperate attempts to understand his situation. His compass was spinning freely. His radio was picking up signals from stations that should have been thousands of miles out of range. But the most chilling part came in the final minutes. Kenji's voice dropped, filled with a new kind of terror. "There are people on the ground," he whispered, "hundreds of them standing in perfect rows. They are looking up at us. All of them. Looking up at exactly the same angle, like they knew we were coming." "Are they waving?" Dr. Mitchell asked, a hopeful tremor in her voice. "No," Kenji said, "they are not waving. They are just standing there, perfectly still. And Sarah, they don't look right. The proportions are wrong. Too tall. Their arms are too long. This is not a human settlement." The recording captured the sound of the engine roaring as Kenji attempted to change course, but his voice indicated the aircraft was not responding. "I have full power. Controls are responding, but we are going down anyway. It's like something is pulling us toward the ground. The altimeter is climbing while we descend. This is impossible." In the final moments, all three voices could be heard discussing the impossible reality of their situation. The instruments showed them gaining altitude while they were clearly descending. The GPS showed them over flat tundra while they could see mountains below. Kenji reported that the sun appeared to be setting in the north. The last clear transmission was Kenji's voice, suddenly, eerily calm. "We are going to impact in approximately 30 seconds. I want to state for the record that none of our instruments are providing accurate information. We are not where we think we are. This is not when we think it is. And I do not believe we are going to crash where our bodies will be found." The recording ended with the sickening final sound of impact. The official investigation concluded that Kenji experienced spatial disorientation and crashed. The instrument readings were attributed to multiple cascading equipment failures. but they could never explain how so many independent, recently serviced systems could all fail at the same time, in ways that defied the laws of physics. The case was officially closed, but local pilots know the truth. They have a name for the region where Kenji Nakamura disappeared. They call it the confusion zone, a place where instruments lie, where directions become meaningless, and where aircraft can simply vanish into a landscape that exists somewhere between what is real and what should be impossible. I still have a copy of that recording. Sometimes, late at night, I listen to those last 17 minutes and I think Kenji was right. Maybe they didn't crash where their bodies were found. Maybe they crashed somewhere else entirely, in a place that doesn't exist on our maps but exists nonetheless, waiting for the next pilot to fly to. Close to secrets that should remain hidden. Story 5. The ice fisherwoman and the lake's secret ice fishing had been in Alf O'Brien's Irish blood for generations, a sacred tradition passed down through a long line of fishermen who knew the lakes of County Cork like the backs of their weathered hands. But the ancient frozen lakes of Alaska held secrets far older and darker than anything her ancestors had ever encountered. Oif had moved to Anchorage in 2018, a brilliant marine biologist with a restless spirit. She had inherited her grandfather's collection of antique fishing equipment and a burning, almost obsessive desire to test her family's traditional skills against the legendary monstrous fish of the last frontier. What she discovered beneath the thick black ice of Lake Shalatna was something that should have remained buried, undisturbed, for another 1,000 years. I met Aoif at Murphy's Bait and Tackle in Wasilla, the shop where I work part-time. She stood out immediately. Most tourists who came through were looking for basic equipment and guided tours, hoping for a photo op with a decent-sized trout. But Aoif was different. She moved with a quiet confidence, her questions sharp and technical. She asked about ice thickness, underwater topography, and the specific behavioral patterns of fish during extreme cold snaps. Her knowledge was so profound that she impressed even our most experienced local guides, men who had spent their entire lives on these frozen lakes. Aoif was a fascinating paradox. She was a scientist, trained in rigorous methodology and empirical data, but she was also the keeper of an ancient, almost mystical tradition. Her grandfather, Seamus O'Brien, had been a legend in Ireland, a man who had spent 70 years fishing the lakes and rivers of his homeland. When he passed away, he left Oif his most prized possessions, a collection of hand-forged fishing tools, some of which dated back to the 1800s. These were not museum pieces, they were functional, deadly equipment, designed by generations of O'Brien fishermen to catch species that modern commercial fishermen couldn't touch. My grandfather always said that fish were older than humans, Oif told me one afternoon, her voice a soft brogue as she examined our selection of ice augers. He believed that if you knew how to listen to the water, really listen, the fish would tell you stories about what came before us. What made Aoif's approach unique was her fusion of ancient Irish techniques with modern science. She used her grandfather's traditional hand-forged hooks and lines made from materials he had taught her to prepare, but she also carried a formidable arsenal of modern technology, underwater cameras, high-frequency sonar equipment, and water testing kits. Her goal was to scientifically document the efficacy of traditional methods versus modern approaches. In January of 2022, she set her sights on Lake Shalatna, a remote, notoriously difficult body of water about 60 miles northwest of Anchorage. The lake was known for its excellent ice fishing, but it was a beast to get to, requiring a snowmobile or a rugged ATV, and the single-access road was often impassable during winter storms. Most importantly for Aoif's research, Lake Shalatna was deep, over 400 feet in some areas, and connected to a network of underground springs that kept portions of the lake from freezing completely, even during the harshest winters. Aoif had studied geological surveys of the area and had identified a specific section of the lake that fascinated her. A place where the bottom dropped off sharply from shallow fishing grounds into a deep, unmapped trench. Her theory was that these transitional zones were where the real monsters lurked, and that her traditional methods would be most effective there. Her first 2 expeditions in January were a stunning success. Using her grandfather's equipment, she pulled lake trout from the depths that were larger than anything caught in the area for years, cementing her reputation among the local fishing community. But it was her 3rd trip, on February 18th, that changed everything. Oif had positioned her small, insulated shelter over what her sonar showed as a gradual slope leading into the deepest part of the trench. The ice was solid, nearly 3 feet thick, but her equipment detected the telltale signature of open, moving water far below, confirming the presence of active springs. She had just finished setting up her gear when her underwater camera, dangling deep in the frigid darkness, picked up something unusual. At first, she thought it was a large piece of submerged timber or debris. The camera showed a long, dark object resting on the lake bottom, approximately 60 feet below the ice. But as she adjusted the camera angle and increased the intensity of its lights, she realized the object had too much geometric regularity to be natural. It appeared to be constructed from massive, perfectly fitted stones like ancient masonry, forming what looked like a rectangular structure, a sarcophagus or a chest, about 12 feet long and 4 feet wide. "That can't be right," Aoif muttered to herself, her breath fogging in the cold air of the shelter as she recorded video of the structure. According to all geological surveys, this entire area had been buried under a mile of glacial ice until relatively recently, in geological terms. There should not be any human constructions on the lake bottom, especially not something that looked ancient. Using her grandfather's traditional weighted line, Aoif began to fish directly above the structure. The technique was a delicate art, requiring her to lower a specially prepared hook very slowly, while maintaining constant sensitive contact with the bottom. It was a method that allowed an experienced fisherman to feel the underwater environment in a way modern sonar could not replicate. What Oif felt through the line was wrong. Instead of the soft mud or rocky bottom she expected, the weighted line seemed to be resting on something hard and hollow. When she gently tapped the weight, a distinct sound traveled up the line, through the water and the thick ice. A hollow thump, thump, like striking an empty container. More disturbing was what happened when she began to pull the line up. Instead of the simple resistance of water and weight, she felt something tugging back. It wasn't the frantic, panicked fight of a large fish. This felt different. It was a slow, deliberate, intelligent pull, as if something below was trying to draw the line deeper into the darkness. Aoif, startled but resolute, pulled back harder. She managed to reel the line up about 20 feet before whatever was holding it let go with a sudden, violent jerk, causing her to stumble backward in her shelter. When she examined the line, her blood ran cold. The traditional hand-forged hook her grandfather had made was gone. In its place, tied with a knot she had never seen before, was a new hook, carved from a piece of bone. The craftsmanship was unlike anything she had ever seen. The bone hook was covered in intricate, swirling symbols that seemed to shift and change as she turned it in the light. The material itself was strange. It was almost translucent with a faint blue-green tint that seemed to glow with its own internal luminescence. Against all rational judgment, Aoif decided to continue fishing with the mysterious hook. The scientist in her, the part driven by an insatiable curiosity, overrode the primal fear screaming in her mind. She had a scientific obligation to investigate. She lowered the line again, this time with her underwater camera following it down, determined to see what would happen. The video footage from that day, which Oif later shared with me, is something that has haunted my waking and sleeping moments ever since. It challenges everything we think we know about what lives in the deep, dark places of our world. As the bone hook descended toward the stone structure, the water around it began to change. What had appeared to be empty black water started to fill with shapes, long, sinuous, undulating forms that moved with an undeniable purpose and intelligence. At first, Oif thought she was seeing a school of large eels, but as the creatures came closer to the camera's light, their true horrifying nature became apparent. They were not fish. They were something far older, far more alien. The creatures had serpentine bodies covered in scales that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making them appear as moving voids in the water. Their heads were elongated and flattened, with huge, lidless eyes that reflected the camera's light like perfect silver mirrors. But the most disturbing feature, the detail that made Oif gasp in terror, was their appendages. Along their bodies were what appeared to be multiple slender arms, ending in long, delicate hands, with far too many fingers. And these hands were using tools, carved implements of stone and bone that they were using to meticulously construct or repair the stone structure on the lake bottom. The bone hook seemed to attract their immediate attention. Several of the creatures glided toward it, examining it with an intelligence that was plain to see. Then one of them reached out with one of its many-fingered hands and took hold of the hook. Impossibly, it began to communicate. We felt it as a series of complex vibrations traveling up the fishing line. They were not random movements, but distinct rhythmic patterns, a language of pulses and pressures far more sophisticated than Morse code. As she held the line, her mind was flooded with images, with concepts. Not visual images, but a direct transfer of understanding that bypassed her senses entirely. She began to comprehend. The stone structure was not a tomb, but a preservation chamber, a library of ancient knowledge. The creatures, which she came to understand, were called the Sluag Mhara, an old Gaelic term from her grandfather's stories meaning the sea host, had been the guardians of this lake for millennia. They had built the chamber to preserve something entrusted to their care before the last great ice age, something that surface dwellers were never meant to discover. The bone hook, she learned, was a key. Her grandfather's fishing methods were not just traditional techniques, they were remnants of an ancient pact between certain human families and the Sluag Mara, a way to communicate respectfully with the underwater guardians. But the pact had been broken when her grandfather died without passing on the full knowledge. Oif had been using the tools correctly but blindly and had inadvertently reopened a channel that should have remained closed. The creature showed her what lay within the chamber, artifacts from a human civilization that existed before the ice, a civilization that had achieved a level of knowledge that would shatter our modern world. The Sluag Mara were charged with keeping this knowledge safe until humanity evolved enough to use it responsibly. But now, they were in trouble. Climate change and increased human activity were threatening their hidden sites across Alaska. The chamber in Lake Chalatna had been damaged by recent seismic activity and its contents were beginning to leak. The Sluag Mara needed a new guardian, a new liaison. They had chosen Oif not by chance, but because her bloodline carried the genetic markers necessary to interpret their communications. They offered her a choice. She could cut the line and forget. They would modify her memories, and she could return to her normal life. Or she could accept her family's ancient obligation. She would gain access to knowledge beyond her wildest dreams, but she would be bound by an oath of secrecy forever. Oif O'Brien, the scientist and the traditionalist, made her choice. She accepted the role of guardian. The moment she made her decision, the bone hook dissolved in the water. But the knowledge it had transferred remained, permanently integrated into her consciousness. When she returned to Anchorage, she was different. She abandoned her academic pursuits and dedicated herself to field conservation work. She was still seen at remote lakes, but she was no longer fishing for trout. She was working with the Sluag Mahara, repairing their ancient chambers, catching secrets instead of fish. Oph officially disappeared in April 2023. The last confirmed sighting was by a helicopter pilot who saw her on a remote storm-battered lake, seemingly communicating with dark shapes moving just beneath the ice. I believe she simply completed her transformation. She is still out there, a guardian of the deep, ensuring that the things that sleep beneath the ice stay sleeping, until we are wise enough to handle the responsibility of waking them. Story 6. The Homesteader and the Forest's Embrace. When the park rangers finally found Kwame Asante's abandoned homestead, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the vast wilderness bordering Denali National Park, they found his journal. That journal told a story so profoundly disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that it led them to seal the property permanently and classify the entire area as unsuitable for human habitation. The official report, the one that sits in a dusty government file, cites unstable geological conditions and potential environmental hazards. But the real reason, the one whispered among the rangers who were there that day, was far more terrifying than anything they could ever put in public paperwork. I learned about Kwame's story because I was that park ranger. My name is Ben, and it was my duty to discover his abandoned property in the fall of September 2022. Part of my job involved conducting periodic informal checks on the homesteaders and settlers living near the park boundaries, both to ensure they were complying with environmental regulations and, more importantly, to provide emergency assistance if needed. It's a lonely life out there, and people disappear all the time. Kwame Asante had come to Alaska in 2019, chasing the same rugged, romantic dream that has drawn thousands of disillusioned souls to the last frontier. The dream of complete self-sufficiency on one's own piece of untamed wilderness. He was a brilliant software engineer from Atlanta, a man who had grown tired of the sterile glow of computer screens, the endless traffic, and the hollow noise of corporate life. At 35, he had saved enough money to purchase 40 acres of remote land through a government auction of surplus federal property. It was his canvas, and he planned to paint a masterpiece of off-grid living. His chosen land was the definition of isolation. 40 acres of mixed forest and meadow, with a seasonal creek whispering through the center. The property had been surveyed in the 1960s but never developed, which made it perfect for someone seeking total solitude. His nearest neighbor was a 12-mile trek away, and the closest town was a grueling 2-hour drive on old logging roads that became completely impassable during the long winter months. When Kwame first arrived, he lived in a heavy-duty camping trailer, a temporary shell, while he painstakingly constructed his permanent cabin. He was no amateur. He had done years of extensive research on sustainable living and had planned every single aspect of his homestead with meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail. His setup was a marvel of engineering, a powerful array of solar panels for electricity, a tall wind turbine for backup power, a hyper-efficient wood-burning stove for heat, a deep well for pure cold water, and a large, fenced-in garden area for growing his own food. I first met Kwame in July of 2019 during a routine survey of the area. He was friendly, sharp, and radiated a powerful intelligence. He was clearly well prepared for the immense challenges of wilderness living. His cabin was a work of art, solid construction built from locally sourced timber, and his infrastructure was more sophisticated than most established homesteads I had ever encountered. He proudly showed me his workshop, his ingenious food storage systems, and his communication equipment. A powerful ham radio for emergencies and a satellite internet connection for maintaining contact with the outside world. "This is everything I ever wanted," Kwame told me, his voice filled with a genuine, profound contentment as we stood on his front porch, looking out over the pristine, silent wilderness. No traffic, no noise, no deadlines. Just me and the land working together. I visited Kwame's homestead twice more during 2019 and once in 2020. Each time he seemed happy and healthy, though I noticed he was becoming increasingly focused, almost consumed by his self-sufficient lifestyle. By 2020, he was growing most of his own food, raising chickens for eggs, and had even constructed a small, ingenious greenhouse that extended his growing season through the shorter days. He spoke less and less about his former life in Atlanta and more about the deep, ancient rhythms of the wilderness. My last face-to-face conversation with Kwame was in September of 2020. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he was considering disconnecting his satellite internet. He found outside communication to be increasingly irrelevant, a distraction from his daily life. "The land teaches you things," he explained, his eyes looking past me toward the dense forest that bordered his property. "But only if you are quiet enough to listen. Most people never stop talking long enough to learn what the wilderness is trying to say." When I didn't see Kwame during my 2021 patrols, I wasn't immediately alarmed. I assumed he was simply embracing his reclusive nature, a common trajectory for homesteaders. As long as they weren't violating any regulations, we respected their privacy. I made a note in my log of seeing smoke from his cabin chimney during the winter months, which indicated he was alive and well. It wasn't until September of 2022 that a cold, prickling sense of wrongness began to creep over me. During a routine aerial survey of the region, I noticed that Kwame's property showed no signs of recent activity. There was no smoke from the chimney. The garden was overgrown. There was no movement around the buildings. The entire homestead was still, silent, and looked abandoned. The pilot agreed to land in a nearby meadow, and I made the trek to investigate on foot. Kwame's homestead was perfectly intact but clearly deserted. The cabin door was unlocked, swinging slightly in the breeze. The interior showed signs of a hasty, unplanned departure. Food had been left on the counters, now attracting insects and small animals. Clothing was scattered around as if someone had been packing in a panic. Most telling, Kwame's emergency supplies, his go bag, his extra rations, things no experienced homesteader would ever leave behind, were still in their designated storage locations. I found Kwame's journal on his kitchen table. It was open to an entry dated March 15, 2022. The handwriting was Kwame's, but the content, the ideas, were unlike anything I would have expected from the rational, methodical man I had known. The journal covered nearly 3 years of his life on the homestead, beginning with normal, predictable observations about weather, wildlife, and daily chores. But as I read on, the entries began to shift, descending into a spiral of obsession and bizarre, terrifying revelation. The early entries were normal. July 14th, 2019. Completed installation of solar panel array. Saw a family of foxes near the creek. November 3rd, 2019, first major snowfall. Cabin heating system working perfectly. But by late 2020, the tone began to change. September 30th, 2020. The trees are watching me. I know how that sounds, but after 18 months of careful daily observation, I am certain that the forest around my property exhibits coordinated behavior. The trees shift their positions slightly over periods of days or weeks. The changes are deliberate, not random. October 15th, 2020. Confirmed my suspicions. Using stakes and string to mark their positions, I have documented systematic movement in the forest. The trees are repositioning themselves subtly to optimize their viewing angles toward my cabin. This is impossible according to everything I know about botany, but the evidence is undeniable. November 8th, 2020. The animals are reporting to the trees. I have observed foxes, rabbits, and even birds moving in patterns that can only be described as information gathering. They approach the cabin, observe my activities for specific periods, then return to particular trees, always the same trees. The entries for 2021 documented Kwame's increasing isolation and his growing conviction that the forest was not just alive, but actively, consciously intelligent. January 12th, 2021. Disconnected the satellite internet. I do not need outside communication anymore. The forest provides all the companionship and intellectual stimulation I require. I am beginning to understand that human civilization is just a temporary interruption in a much larger, older conversation. June 7th, 2021. I made first direct contact with the forest intelligence today. While working in the garden, I received a clear telepathic communication from what I can only describe as the collective consciousness of the local ecosystem. The message was welcoming, but it included warnings about maintaining a proper, respectful relationship with the land. The most disturbing entries came from late 2021 and early 2022, as Kwame's journal documented his progressive, horrifying integration into this forest intelligence. October 31st, 2021. Physical changes are beginning. My vision is improving, especially my ability to see plant auras and energy fields. I can now perceive the electromagnetic communications between the trees. My sleep requirements are decreasing as I find I can absorb energy directly from the environment. December 25th, 2021. I no longer need to hunt or grow food in the traditional sense. The forest provides all necessary nutrients through a direct biological interface. My digestive system is adapting to process cellulose and other plant materials that normal humans cannot metabolize. February 10th, 2022. My skin is developing chlorophyll patches that allow for photosynthetic energy absorption. My hair and nails are growing faster and stronger. I am beginning to sprout small, root-like appendages from the soles of my feet that connect with the underground fungal networks when I stand barefoot on the soil. The final entries were barely recognizable as human thought. March 1st, 2022. The human form is becoming obsolete. The forest intelligence offers an opportunity to transcend individual consciousness and join a collective ecosystem awareness. I will maintain this journal until the transformation is complete, for the benefit of any future researchers. March 8th, 2022. My arms are extending into branch-like appendages. I can now directly interface with the tree communication systems. My individual identity is dissolving into the larger forest consciousness. The process is irreversible, but it represents an evolutionary advancement. March 15th, 2022. This is my final human entry. Tomorrow I will become permanently integrated with the forest intelligence. My physical form will be absorbed into the root and fungal systems while my consciousness joins the collective awareness of this regional ecosystem. This is not death, but a transformation into a higher form of existence. I recommend this property be sealed to prevent other humans from disturbing the integration process. The journal ended there, but attached to the final entry were several pages of text written in a completely different alien script, symbols that looked like abstract representations of plant structures, root systems, and cellular diagrams. After documenting the scene, I searched the property. I found no human remains, But I did discover several areas where the vegetation grew in unnaturally dense, complex patterns. In one area near Kwame's garden, the soil had been disturbed in a pattern roughly the size and shape of a human body. The soil was impossibly rich and dark, and sprouting from it were strange hybrid plants I couldn't identify. Some with structures that looked disturbingly like human fingers, teeth, or eyes. Based on my report, the Forest Service classified Kwame's property as a biological hazard zone and restricted all access. The official explanation was unknown plant pathogens, but the real reason was what happened to the research team sent to investigate. 3 botanists from the University of Alaska spent 5 days at the site. When they emerged, all 3 reported experiencing plant telepathy, direct communication with the forest. Their scientific reports were filled with wild, unproven theories about plant intelligence and ecosystem consciousness. They recommended the site be designated a botanical contact zone. Within 6 months, all 3 had resigned from their academic positions and vanished into the Alaskan wilderness. Kwame Asante's homestead remains sealed to this day. But the phenomenon is spreading. Other homesteaders in remote areas have disappeared, their stories echoing Kwame's. The official position is psychological isolation. But those of us who have seen the evidence know the truth. There is something in Alaska's wilderness, an ancient, patient intelligence that is actively recruiting. And for those who choose to live in the deepest, most isolated parts of the forest, it is always ready to offer them a permanent home, a place where they will never be alone again. Because sometimes the land doesn't just teach you things, sometimes it decides to keep you. Story 7. The Physicist and the Living Lights Doctor. Ingrid Johansson came to Alaska to study the aurora borealis, the northern lights. She discovered that the lights were studying her back. As a leading atmospheric physicist from the prestigious University of Stockholm, Ingrid had spent 15 years of her life dedicated to researching the complex electromagnetic phenomena that create the celestial spectacle. She was a woman of science, of data, of logic. But nothing in her rigorous academic training, nothing in the cold, hard facts of physics could have prepared her for what she encountered during the brutal, isolating winter of 2021. Alone in a remote research station perched high above the Arctic Circle. I knew Ingrid professionally, or at least I was familiar with her project. My name is David, and I work as a technical coordinator for the National Science Foundation. My job is to help international researchers establish temporary facilities in Alaska's most extreme and unforgiving environments. Ingrid's project was ambitious, even by our demanding standards. She wanted to position a suite of highly sensitive monitoring equipment in one of the most magnetically active and therefore most isolated regions of Alaska. Her goal was to study aurora formations that were impossible to observe from more accessible locations. Ephemeral displays that were rumored to exist but had never been properly documented. The site Ingrid selected was a desolate, wind-swept plateau approximately 150 miles north of Fairbanks. It was accessible only by helicopter and only during a brief, unpredictable window of favorable weather. The elevation provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the northern horizon, while the extreme remote location eliminated all light pollution and electromagnetic interference from human sources. Most importantly, the area was situated directly beneath what atmospheric scientists call an aurora corridor, a region where the northern lights appear with an unusual, almost supernatural frequency and intensity. Ingrid's research focused on a controversial phenomenon she had observed in satellite data but had never witnessed directly. Aurora formations that seemed to exhibit coordinated, intelligent behavior rather than the random, chaotic patterns typically associated with solar-wind interactions. Her preliminary analysis suggested that certain aurora displays might represent a form of complex electromagnetic communication, a language written in light and plasma across the upper atmosphere. The research station we helped her establish was essentially a high-tech winterized laboratory, a tiny bubble of warmth and science in an ocean of lethal cold. It was powered by generators heated by redundant propane systems and packed with her custom equipment. Spectrometers, magnetometers, radio frequency analyzers, and high-speed cameras capable of recording aurora activity across multiple electromagnetic spectrums. Ingrid arrived at the station in November 2021, planning to conduct her observations through the long polar night until March 2022. The first 6 weeks of her expedition proceeded exactly as expected. She was a model of scientific objectivity and precision. She documented dozens of spectacular aurora events, collected a mountain of electromagnetic data that supported her theories, and maintained regular professional contact with her research team back in Sweden. Her reports from this period were filled with the cool, detached language of a scientist at work. November 28, 2021. Observed a remarkable aurora display lasting 4.7 hours with coordinated color transitions across a 200-kilometer front. Electromagnetic readings suggest synchronized plasma flows that cannot be explained by standard solar wind models. December 15, 2021. Recorded an aurora formation that appeared to respond to radio transmissions from the research station. When I broadcast specific frequencies, the aurora's intensity increased measurably within 3 to 5 minutes. The correlation could be coincidental, but the pattern has now repeated 6 times. January 2, 2022. The aurora displays are becoming more frequent and are lasting longer than historical averages for this region. I am beginning to observe distinct geometric patterns within the light formations that suggest an underlying organizational structure. But by late January, Ingrid's reports began to change. The detached scientific tone started to fray at the edges, replaced by a growing sense of awe and eventually something akin to obsession. January 24, 2022. The aurora formations are definitely responding to my equipment. It is no longer a question. When I adjust my spectrometer frequencies, the lights shift their color accordingly. When I point my directional antennas toward specific coordinates, the aurora activity intensifies in those exact areas. This implies a direct real-time interaction between my terrestrial equipment and the atmospheric phenomena. It is as if I am in a dialogue. February 3, 2022. I have discovered that the aurora displays contain embedded information patterns. By analyzing the high-speed photography frame by frame, I can identify recurring, non-random sequences of light pulses that resemble complex data transmission protocols. The patterns are too intricate and too consistent to be electromagnetic noise. It is a signal. February 12, 2022. I have successfully decoded portions of the aurora light patterns using signal processing algorithms I developed on site. The embedded information appears to be 3-dimensional mapping data. It is showing me locations throughout Alaska where similar electromagnetic anomalies occur. The lights are providing me with coordinates. They are telling me where to look next. Her supervisors in Sweden became increasingly concerned. Ingrid's isolation combined with the bizarre direction of her research was a red flag. They attempted to arrange for additional personnel to join her at the station to provide both support and a reality check. But the weather turned. A series of brutal Arctic storms prevented any helicopter access throughout most of February. Ingrid was completely, utterly alone. During this period of forced isolation, her communications became more sporadic, and her theories grew more radical. challenging the fundamental assumptions of atmospheric physics. February 18th, 2022. The northern lights are not a random phenomenon caused by solar particles. They represent a form of consciousness that exists in the upper atmosphere, an intelligence composed of electromagnetic fields and plasma formations. This consciousness has been trying to communicate with surface dwellers for centuries, and we have been too primitive to understand. February 25th, 2022. I made direct contact with the Aurora intelligence during last night's display. The communication occurs through a modulation of electromagnetic fields that interfaces directly with human neural activity. The experience is indescribable. It is like receiving pure thought from an entity whose consciousness spans thousands of kilometers. March 5th, 2022. The Aurora consciousness has revealed its true nature. It is not native to Earth. It represents a form of nomadic, non-biological life that travels between star systems using planetary magnetic fields and atmospheric phenomena as a medium for transportation and communication. The northern lights are its method of establishing contact with nascent planetary intelligences. At this point, Ingrid's research team lost regular contact with her. Her scheduled radio check-ins ceased. When she did communicate, it was in short, cryptic bursts, her reports filled with claims that were impossible to verify. The final communication from Ingrid came on March 18th, 2022. It was not a voice message, but a massive data transmission. She sent several gigabytes of electromagnetic recordings, spectrographic analyses, and high-resolution photography to her colleagues in Sweden. Along with the data was a brief, chilling text message. The Aurora consciousness has invited me to join its collective awareness. This represents an unprecedented opportunity for humanity to establish contact with non-terrestrial intelligence. I am uploading all of my research data for your analysis. If the integration is successful, future communications will be transmitted through Aurora displays visible from populated areas. Look to the sky. When a rescue helicopter battling fierce winds finally reached Ingrid's research station on March 25th, they found the facility intact but eerily abandoned. All of her equipment was still running, humming away, automatically recording data. Her personal belongings, including the heavy winter clothing she would have needed to survive for even a minute outside, were all present. Her emergency beacon had never been activated. The rescue team conducted an extensive search of the surrounding snow-blasted area, but they found no trace of Ingrid. There were no footprints leading away from the station, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if she had simply evaporated. But the most puzzling discovery was the data left on her equipment. The cameras had captured hundreds of hours of Aurora activity during the period she was silent. The footage showed phenomena that defied scientific explanation. The recordings documented Aurora formations that moved with obvious, undeniable intelligence. Instead of the usual flowing curtains of light, these displays formed complex geometric shapes, intricate symbols and structures that resembled vast, celestial machinery. Some formations appeared to be reaching down from the upper atmosphere toward the research station, creating brilliant pulsating columns of light that extended far, closer to the ground than should be physically possible. The final recordings were the most disturbing. They showed the Aurora lights entering the research station itself. The internal security cameras captured streams of colored light, ethereal and yet solid, moving through the laboratory. They interacted with her equipment, forming intricate patterns around the location where Ingrid would have been working. The last clear image from the cameras showed Ingrid standing in the center of the laboratory. She was surrounded by the Aurora lights, which had somehow manifested at ground level. She appeared calm, serene, her arms outstretched as if embracing the electromagnetic phenomena. The lights seemed to be merging with her body, her physical form dissolving and reforming into a humanoid figure composed of the same shimmering plasma that normally existed only in the highest reaches of the atmosphere. The final frame showed the aurora lights lifting this new combined human electromagnetic entity upward, passing effortlessly through the ceiling and walls of the research station and ascending back into the sky. After that, the cameras recorded only normal aurora activity in the far distance. The official report classified Ingrid's disappearance as death by exposure, a convenient if baseless conclusion. But those who have studied her final data know the truth. Since her disappearance, aurora displays throughout Alaska have become more frequent, more intense, and they often exhibit patterns that resemble complex technological signals. Radio operators have reported receiving strange transmissions during these events, transmissions that contain what appear to be advanced scientific data. Dr. Ingrid Johansson was never found, but many believe her presence can still be detected in Alaska's night sky. In the region where she disappeared, the northern lights now sometimes form patterns that resemble a lone, dancing human figure. Local indigenous communities who have watched the skies for generations say that the lights now sometimes speak in a new voice, sharing knowledge of the world. They call her the one who joined the sky. For Ingrid, it seems the goal was never just to study the lights. It was to become one of them. Because sometimes the greatest discoveries require the researcher to leave behind everything that once defined them as human. बिल्कुल, पेश है, आठवां हिस्सा। इस कहानी को भी मैंने आपके 20,000 लफ्जों के टारगेट को ध्यान में रखते हुए पूरी तफसील और गहराई के साथ लिखा है। Mr. Chill Chapters, 10 True Most Disturbing Alaskan Horror Stories, Part 8. Story 8, The Musher and the Phantom Race. The Iditarod is more than a race. It's a 1,000-mile-long crucible of ice, wind, and sheer, soul-crushing endurance. It's brutal enough on its own, a relentless test of will against the harshest elements on Earth. But the race that Pavle Petrov ran in 2019 took him through a territory that does not exist on any map, a place where checkpoints appear and disappear like mirages in the snow, and where the very concept of time becomes as malleable and treacherous as the ice beneath his sled runners. I first heard about Pavle's bizarre experience from a fellow musher, a friend of mine who witnessed the aftermath at the final race banquet in Nome. He described how Pavle, a man known for his stoic and methodical nature, tried to explain to the incredulous race officials why his GPS data showed impossible locations and why his checkpoint times didn't match any official records. It was the story of a man whose reality had been fractured by the Alaskan wilderness. Pavle Petrov was a veteran musher from Novosibirsk, Russia. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. At 42 years old, he was known throughout the international sled dog racing community for his almost robotic approach to racing, his exceptional navigation skills, and his uncanny ability to maintain precise timing through the most challenging conditions imaginable. Before becoming a professional dog musher, he had spent 15 years as a surveyor and cartographer, mapping the remote, unpeopled regions of Siberia for geological survey companies. He understood terrain, weather patterns, and navigation better than most pilots. His reputation was built on unshakable consistency. Pavle Petrov never got lost. For his first Iditarod in 2019, his preparation was, as expected, extensive. He had studied satellite imagery of the entire route until he had memorized every twist and turn. He had programmed multiple military-grade GPS units with the precise coordinates for every official checkpoint and emergency shelter. His sled was a fortress of technology carrying communication equipment that would allow him to contact race officials from any point along the trail. His dogs were a perfectly conditioned team, a testament to his disciplined training regimen. The race began normally. Pavle's strategy was conservative but effective. Maintain a steady pace through the early checkpoints, preserve his dog's strength for the brutal middle sections along the Yukon River and the Bering Sea coast, and then push hard during the final sprint to Nome. The first indication that something was profoundly wrong came on day 3, approximately 200 miles into the race. According to his GPS and his own meticulous race timing, he should have been approaching the Rhone checkpoint, a mandatory stop where mushers rest their dogs and resupply. But instead of the familiar rustic log cabin that served as the checkpoint station, Pavle found himself approaching a settlement that did not appear on any of his maps. It was a town, but a town unlike any he had ever seen. It consisted of several dozen buildings arranged in a perfect, unnatural grid pattern. The structures themselves appeared to be made from some kind of translucent crystalline material that reflected the low winter light in strange, painful ways. Smoke rose from the chimneys and from the warm lights glowed in the windows. But the architecture was alien. The doorways were too tall and narrow. The windows were positioned too high on the walls, and the steps leading to the entrances were spaced for a stride much longer than that of a normal human. Most disturbing was the complete and utter absence of people. The settlement was clearly inhabited. There were fresh tracks in the snow, laundry hanging frozen on lines, and the distinct smell of cooking food in the air. But no one was visible. The town was alive but empty. Pavle's dogs, normally fearless and driven, became agitated as they approached. They whined and pulled against their harnesses, trying to veer away from the strange town. Pavle, unnerved, tried to radio the race officials to report his bizarre discovery. But his communication equipment, a top-of-the-line satellite system, received only a wall of impenetrable static. His 3 separate GPS units, his fail-safes, had all gone haywire. One showed him on the official race route. Another showed his location as being 150 miles north of where he should be. The third displayed coordinates that placed him somewhere in the middle of the Bering Sea. Despite his growing unease, Pavle was a pragmatist. His dogs needed rest, and he needed to replenish his supplies. He guided his reluctant team down what appeared to be the main street of the settlement. At the center of the town, he found a building that seemed to serve the function of a checkpoint station. It had all the familiar signs: bales of straw for the dogs, containers of food and water, and a logbook for mushers to record their arrival times. But when Pavle opened the logbook, a chill colder than the Arctic air snaked down his spine. It was filled with entries from mushers he did not recognize, written in languages he could not identify, with arrival dates that spanned several decades. The most recent entry, written in clear English, was dated March 8, 2019, 2 days in the future according to Pavle's own race schedule. The signature was J. Harrison, with a trail position of 23. Pavle knew every single musher in the 2019 race. There was no J. Harrison. While his dogs rested, nervously eating the strange, odorless food provided, Pavle explored more of the settlement. He found a kennel facility housing hundreds of sled dogs. But these were not normal huskies. They were larger, leaner, with eyes that reflected the light like polished mirrors and coats of fur that seemed to absorb the light, making them look like shadows. As he watched, the strange dogs began to communicate with his own team, not by barking or howling, but through a low, harmonic hum that seemed to carry complex information. Pavle's dogs, who had been anxious and fearful, immediately became calm and alert, as if they were receiving detailed instructions. Pavle decided he had to leave. He couldn't stay in this impossible place. But when he tried to depart, he discovered that the trail leading away from the checkpoint had changed. Where there had been a single path, there were now 7 different trails, branching off in various directions. His GPS units were still useless, each providing a different nonsensical reading. Choosing the path that seemed most likely to lead back to the real world, Pavle mushed for what felt like hours through an alien yet strangely familiar landscape. When he finally blessedly reached what appeared to be the official Rhone checkpoint, the real log cabin he had been expecting, he was met with utter confusion. According to the race officials there, he had arrived exactly on schedule. There had been no unusual delays. Pavle's confusion deepened when he examined the official checkpoint log. His arrival time was recorded as expected, but there was no record of the massive hours-long detour he had taken. The GPS data downloaded from his sled by the race officials showed a perfect straight line from the previous checkpoint to Rhone, with no deviations. When Pavle, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration, tried to describe the strange settlement to the other mushers, they looked at him with pity. They had passed through the same area just hours before or after him and had seen nothing but the endless empty snow of the established trail. When he showed them the photos he was sure he had taken of the crystalline buildings, his camera's screen showed only blurry images of snow-covered trees. The race officials and other mushers dismissed his experience as a hallucination, a glitch in the brain brought on by sleep deprivation and extreme cold, a common affliction on the trail. But Pavle, the cartographer, the man of maps and precision, knew the difference between a tired mind and a fractured reality. This bizarre pattern repeated itself throughout the race. At regular intervals, often when his dogs were at their most exhausted or his supplies were running low, he would encounter these phantom checkpoints. Each one was different, yet they all shared certain characteristics. They were always technologically more advanced than the official checkpoints. The people there were mushers he didn't know, and most unnervingly, his time spent there seemed to not exist. He would arrive, rest for what felt like hours, and then, upon reaching the next official checkpoint, discover that no time had elapsed on the official race clock. It was as if he were stepping into a pocket of reality where time stood still. By the halfway point, Pavle began to suspect the terrifying truth. He wasn't just encountering mysterious checkpoints. He was somehow racing in multiple realities simultaneously. His official Iditarod was proceeding normally, but he was also concurrently participating in a parallel competition, a phantom race that existed in the same geographic space but operated according to a different set of physical laws. During one extended stop at a phantom checkpoint near the Yukon River, he met a musher named Anderson, a man with ancient eyes who claimed to have been racing in these alternative competitions for over 20 years. The official races, like the Iditarod, they're just training exercises, a recruitment tool, Anderson explained, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. They identify mushers who have the potential to compete at levels most people can't even imagine. But participation requires giving up your attachment to conventional reality. Anderson showed Pavle a trophy case filled with awards from competitions he had never heard of. The Trans-Dimensional Arctic Circuit, the Temporal Displacement Championship. The trophies themselves seemed to shift and change substance as he looked at them. When Pavle asked what happened to the mushers who chose to compete exclusively in the phantom races, Anderson's expression became distant. They become part of the racing infrastructure itself, he said softly, guiding new participants through the transition. As Pavle neared the finish line in Nome, he realized he had a choice. He could complete the official 2019 Iditarod and return to his normal life, forever haunted by the unexplainable. Or he could embrace the phantom race, step fully into this new reality, and compete at a level that would shatter every assumption he had about time, space, and the very nature of existence. Pavle chose to complete the official race. He crossed the finish line in Nome on March 17th, his official time placing him squarely in the middle of the field. His GPS data was clean. His checkpoint times were consistent. His first Iditarod was officially recorded as a success. But Pavle returned to Russia a changed man, burdened with the knowledge of a racing system that existed in the cracks of our reality. He continued to compete, but he never again encountered the phantom checkpoints. He had been tested, and he had made his choice. The door had closed. The official record shows that Pavle Petrov finished the 2019 Iditarod in 47th place with no unusual incidents. But those who understand the true, deep nature of the Arctic wilderness know that some races never really end, and some checkpoints exist in places that maps can never describe, because the last frontier is more than just a nickname for Alaska. It is the boundary between the reality we think we know and the infinite, terrifying possibilities that exist just beyond our perception. Mr. Chill Chapters, 10 True, Most Disturbing Alaskan Horror Stories, Part 9. Story 9, The Climate Scientist and the Bubble of Creation. Dr. Amara Okafor's climate research mission on Axel Heiberg Island, one of the most desolate high Arctic locations on the planet, was supposed to last 6 months. The station's emergency beacon, a signal of catastrophic failure and life-threatening danger, activated after just 3 days. But what the rescue team found when they arrived defied everything they thought they knew about physics, biology, and the very fabric of our world. It was a discovery so profound and terrifying that the official report was buried under layers of classification, and the truth was left to fester in the minds of those who were there. I learned about Amara's case because I was the helicopter pilot who flew that initial desperate rescue mission. My name is Greg, and for a decade I've been flying heavy-lift choppers in the Arctic, transporting scientists and supplies to places that feel more like other planets than a part of our own. I flew the team to Station Echo 7, a remote atmospheric research facility perched on a godforsaken rock 200 miles from the nearest human settlement. And I was the one who flew the mission to get them out. Dr. Amara Okafor was a force of nature herself. A brilliant climatologist from the University of Lagos, she had earned international recognition for her controversial work on rapid climate adaptation mechanisms. While most of the scientific community believed that evolution and adaptation were processes that took centuries, if not millennia, Amara's research suggested that, under certain extreme pressures, biological systems could adapt, change, and evolve at a speed that was almost terrifyingly fast. Her theories were groundbreaking but considered fringe, bordering on science fiction. Station Echo 7 was her chance to prove them. The station was part of a multinational climate monitoring network, but its location was unique. It was positioned directly over what geologists called a thermal anomaly zone. Satellite data showed that the ground temperature in a 2-mile radius around the station was consistently 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding frozen landscape, despite there being no apparent geothermal activity. Amara's mission was to study this anomaly, to understand if it was creating a unique microclimate, a natural laboratory for rapid evolution. The station was a marvel of engineering designed for long-term isolated research. It had living quarters, a fully equipped lab, and enough supplies for 8 months. I transported Amara and her team, Dr. James Wright, a sharp meteorologist from Cambridge, and Dr. Lisa Chen, an atmospheric physicist from MIT, to the station on February 10, 2023. They were in high spirits, buzzing with the excitement of discovery. The station was in perfect condition when I left them, a tiny, defiant spark of warmth and light in an endless expanse of white. For the first 3 days, everything proceeded normally. The team sent regular status reports via satellite, their messages filled with a growing sense of wonder. The atmospheric conditions they were discovering were even more unusual than the satellite data had suggested. Dr. Wright's readings showed that the temperature gradients were extreme. Within a half-mile radius, temperatures could vary by as much as 40 degrees, creating distinct microclimate zones. A patch of temperate air next to a pocket of deep freeze that shifted and changed shape over mere hours. Dr. Chen's analysis of the air itself was even more baffling. The atmosphere directly above the station contained trace elements and complex molecular structures that appeared to be synthetic, manufactured, not naturally occurring. Oxygen levels at the ground were nearly 30% higher than normal. But it was Amara's biological analysis that produced the most impossible findings. In the supposedly sterile, frozen soil around the station, she discovered thriving plant and microbial life. But these were not hardy Arctic species. They were tropical and subtropical organisms, ferns, fungi, and bacteria that should have died instantly in the sub-zero temperatures. On February 13th, the team's final scheduled communication was ecstatic. They reported what they described as breakthrough discoveries that would revolutionize the understanding of climate adaptation. Amara specifically mentioned finding evidence of directed environmental modification, suggesting that the climate itself could be artificially controlled. Then silence. When the team missed their scheduled communication on February 14th, we initiated overdue protocols. All attempts to contact Station Echo 7 failed. More concerning, the station's automated weather monitoring systems had also gone silent. On February 15th, the emergency beacon activated, broadcasting a raw, terrifying distress signal that indicated a catastrophic failure of the station's heating and power systems. The message was clear. 3 scientists were freezing to death in the high Arctic. I was dispatched immediately, flying a rescue mission into the teeth of a raging blizzard. It took 6 hours, pushing my helicopter and my skills to their absolute limits. What we found at Station Echo 7, however, was not a scene of disaster. It was a scene of impossibility. From the air, the station appeared to be functioning perfectly. The lights were on. A gentle plume of smoke rose from the heating system's chimney, and the external equipment was humming away. But as we descended, the world turned inside out. Despite the blizzard and the sub-zero temperatures just a few hundred yards away, the immediate area around the station was experiencing a warm, gentle, spring-like day. The temperature on my external gauge jumped from -30 to a balmy 50 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no snow on the ground. Instead, lush green vegetation grew in a perfect circle around the station buildings. The medical team, braced to find hypothermic victims, entered the station. They found Amara, James, and Lisa in perfect health, working calmly in their laboratory, as if it were just another Tuesday afternoon. They claimed they had not activated the emergency beacon and were completely unaware that any distress signal had been sent. But the researchers themselves were wrong. They looked healthier, more vibrant than when I had dropped them off just 5 days earlier. Their skin glowed, their eyes were bright, and they moved, with an energetic purpose that was completely at odds with the usual fatigue of Arctic research. When the medic asked them the date, they all confidently gave a date that was several weeks in the future. They insisted they had been maintaining regular contact, completely unaware of the 2-day silence. The lab itself was a biological wonderland. The air was warm, humid, and rich with the smell of damp earth and blooming flowers. Their specimen containers were filled with impossible trophies, tropical plants, insects from temperate climates, and soil samples teeming with microorganisms that required high humidity and warmth to survive. When asked where they got them, Amara simply pointed outside. "The environment is providing," she said, a strange, beatific smile on her face. She showed us her research notes. She had discovered what she called adaptive environmental bubbles, localized areas where the fundamental parameters of the environment could be rapidly and deliberately modified. According to her data, the area around Station Echo 7 had undergone a complete environmental transformation in just 3 days. She claimed the station had been built on a climate modification node, a naturally occurring system that could be activated and controlled. I had to see for myself. I stepped outside the station and the evidence was undeniable. The ground was covered with thriving vegetation, tropical flowers in vibrant colors, lush grasses, even small fruit trees bearing ripe, fragrant fruit. The soil was warm and rich, but the most unsettling part was the boundary. I walked about 50 yards from the station and it was like hitting an invisible wall. In the space of a single step, the temperature plummeted from 50 degrees to -30. The warm, humid air was replaced by the biting, dry cold of the Arctic. The lush green ground gave way to the stark white of the frozen tundra. I could stand with one foot in a tropical paradise and the other in a lethal blizzard. The researchers insisted they had learned to control it. Dr. Wright, his eyes gleaming with a feverish excitement, demonstrated by adjusting the settings on his meteorological equipment. As he turned a dial, the temperature gauge in my helicopter parked inside the bubble changed by 15 degrees in minutes. The boundary of the bubble visibly moved, expanding outward, consuming more of the frozen tundra. But their data, which they shared with an almost childlike pride, told a more sinister story. The process required enormous amounts of energy drawn from an unknown source. The bubble around Station Echo 7 was consuming power equivalent to a small nuclear reactor, yet there was no reactor. More troubling, our own monitoring equipment at the Rescue Coordination Center showed that the effect was spreading. Atmospheric disturbances like ripples in a pond were appearing across the entire Arctic region, all originating from Echo 7. When we confronted them with this, they were dismissive. Amara argued that temporary disturbances were an acceptable price for a technology that could end climate change forever. They were on the verge of a breakthrough that would allow humanity to create custom-designed, stable environments anywhere on Earth. The decision was made to evacuate them by force if necessary. But just as the confrontation was about to escalate, Doctor, Chen's equipment began to scream in alarm. Her face went pale. "Cascade failure indicators," she whispered. "The system is unstable. It's going to collapse." Faced with the immediate threat of being plunged from a warm spring day into a lethal Arctic storm, the researchers finally agreed to a temporary evacuation. As we prepared to depart, I watched the bubble die. The tropical vegetation withered and turned black in seconds. The warm air vanished, replaced by the howling, freezing wind of the blizzard. Within an hour, the station was once again just a lonely outpost in an endless sea of white, with no trace of the impossible garden that had been there just moments before. The 3 researchers were debriefed and their findings were immediately classified at the highest level. They were separated and reassigned to different projects, forbidden from collaborating or publishing their work. But it was too late. Within 6 months, similar environmental anomalies began appearing at other remote research stations. It seemed Amara hadn't discovered a unique node. She had discovered a global network, and she had taught others how to turn the key. Dr. Amara Okafor was last seen at a climate conference in Geneva, presenting theoretical papers on environmental modification, her eyes still holding that same feverish, brilliant light. Station Echo 7 remains permanently closed, officially due to unstable geological conditions. But those of us who were there know the truth. We know that scattered across the globe, hidden in the most remote places, are nodes of a system that can rewrite the laws of nature. And we know that somewhere out there, brilliant, well-intentioned scientists, driven by the desire to save the world, are still trying to turn the key, not realizing that the door they are opening may not lead to a paradise, but to a reality that our planet was never meant to sustain. Story 10. The ham radio operator and the final transmission. Lucas Romano spent his retirement years in a small, cluttered workshop in Fairbanks, doing what he loved most, operating a ham radio. He was a ghost on the airwaves, a familiar voice to a global community of operators who knew him only by his call sign KL7R. His final transmission on the winter solstice of December 21, 2023 was heard by operators worldwide. But what they received was not just a message from one elderly man in Alaska. It was the beginning of a signal, a virus of consciousness that would corrupt every form of electronic communication on Earth. I was working as a communications technician for the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, when Luca Romano's transmission triggered the largest, most inexplicable electromagnetic anomaly in recorded history. My job was to hunt down illegal broadcasts and rogue signals. I ended up hunting a ghost. Luca Romano was 73 years old. He had moved to Fairbanks in 1995 after retiring from a distinguished career as an electrical engineer in Boston. He wasn't chasing gold or solitude. He was chasing a clear signal. Alaska's unique atmospheric conditions and low electromagnetic interference made it a paradise for long-distance radio communication. For 28 years, Luca operated his amateur radio station KL7R from his home workshop. He was a pillar of the community, providing emergency communications during natural disasters and maintaining a friendly, knowledgeable presence on the airwaves. But Luca was different from most ham radio operators. He wasn't just a hobbyist, he was a renegade genius. As a former electrical engineer, he understood radio frequency theory better than most professionals. His workshop was a mad scientist's dream, filled with custom-built amplifiers that defied legal power limitations. Massive antenna arrays that violated every city zoning regulation, and frequency modulation equipment that operated in shadowy legal gray areas. He held the highest amateur radio licenses, permitting him to operate on frequencies reserved for experimental purposes, and he often collaborated with university researchers studying the strange ways radio signals behaved in the Arctic atmosphere. Luca's true obsession, the project that consumed the final decades of his life, was what he called atmospheric frequency mapping. He was convinced that the northern lights, the aurora borealis, were not just a beautiful natural phenomenon. He believed they were a medium, a carrier wave for a signal of intelligent origin. He had spent decades documenting correlations between aurora activity and strange, non-random radio signals, patterns that suggested a language hidden within the lights. I became aware of Luca's activities because the FCC had started receiving a flood of complaints about unauthorized high-power transmissions originating from the Fairbanks area. Our direction-finding equipment traced the signals directly to Luca's address. But when we investigated, we were stumped. His equipment on paper appeared to be operating within legal power limits. Yet the signals he was generating were achieving a global reach, a propagation that should have been impossible without the power of a commercial broadcasting station. The investigation revealed that Luca had discovered something extraordinary. He had learned how to use the aurora itself as a natural amplifier. By timing his transmissions to coincide with specific patterns of aurora activity, he could hitch a ride on the atmospheric phenomena, achieving a signal strength that was orders of magnitude greater than his actual power output. But what truly concerned the FCC investigators was not the power amplification. It was the content of Luca's transmissions. Instead of normal conversations, his signals contained incredibly complex data streams that resembled encrypted computer code. When our top cryptography specialists analyzed the transmissions, they were baffled. The information patterns didn't conform to any known encryption method. They were something else entirely. On December 20th, 2023, Luca did something unprecedented. He contacted the FCC directly. He wanted to report, in his own words, the successful establishment of two-way communication with non-terrestrial intelligence via atmospheric electromagnetic interface. He claimed that his experimental transmissions had finally been answered by signals originating from within the aurora formations themselves. He said he had developed protocols for conducting structured conversations with what he termed atmospheric entities. The FCC dispatcher who took the call initially assumed Luca was a crank. But when Luca, with the calm precision of an engineer, provided the detailed technical specifications of the signals he was receiving, a chill went through the department. He was describing electromagnetic phenomena that did not match any known terrestrial or satellite communication system. The responding signals, he claimed, used frequency modulation techniques far more sophisticated than our current technology, and contained an information density that exceeded the theoretical limits of electromagnetic communication. Most disturbingly, Luca claimed that the atmospheric entities were teaching him. They were providing him with technical information, blueprints for a new kind of communication that could revolutionize physics. They were showing him how to modify his equipment to allow for a direct neural interface with electromagnetic fields, a technology that would eliminate the need for traditional radio equipment entirely. The decision was made at the highest levels of the FCC. We would not shut him down, not yet. We needed to understand what he had discovered. A team of our best communications specialists and electromagnetic field technicians, including myself, was dispatched to Fairbanks to observe Luca's final experiment and document any unusual effects. We arrived at Luca's workshop on the morning of the winter solstice, December 21st. The place had been transformed. It was no longer a hobbyist's workshop. It was a sophisticated, alien-looking laboratory. Antenna arrays pulsed with a faint-colored light. Signal processing equipment hummed with an energy that made the fillings in our teeth ache. Luca, a small, energetic man with eyes that burned with an intense, feverish light, explained that he had been receiving detailed technical instructions from the entities. He had constructed a new kind of communication device, one that operated by creating a direct resonance with the electromagnetic fields in the upper atmosphere. Traditional radio sends signals through space, Luca explained, his hands gesturing wildly. This system creates a direct electromagnetic linkage with a consciousness that exists within the atmospheric electrical phenomena. I am not transmitting to them. I am joining their communication network. Our instruments went haywire. The equipment was generating structured electromagnetic patterns that resembled the neural activity of a living brain, but at frequencies that corresponded to the aurora. At exactly 11:47 p.m., under the eerie green glow of a massive aurora display that filled the entire sky, Luca initiated his final transmission. But he didn't speak into a microphone. He placed a strange, custom-built headset, a web of wires and glowing crystals, onto his head. The moment the connection was established, every piece of electronic monitoring equipment we had exploded with readings that violated the known laws of physics. We watched, stunned, as Luca's equipment created a visible electromagnetic field that filled his workshop with shimmering patterns of light, a miniature aurora contained within the room. The field seemed to respond to his thoughts. We could hear his side of the conversation through our monitoring equipment. But he was receiving information at a speed that should have been impossible for a human mind to process. Yes, I understand the dimensional resonance requirements, Luca said, his eyes closed, a look of ecstatic discovery on his face. The human electromagnetic spectrum is limited, but you are showing me how to expand the frequency range through consciousness interface. Then the anomaly began to spread. The electromagnetic disturbance created by Luca's transmission escaped the workshop. It didn't propagate like a normal radio wave. It spread like a virus through the global communication infrastructure. Amateur radio operators worldwide began reporting that they were receiving portions of Luca's transmission, but the signals were appearing simultaneously in places that should have been impossible to reach. The signal strength was constant, whether you were in Australia or Argentina. The content of the spreading transmission was the most terrifying part. It wasn't just voice or data, it was what could only be described as direct consciousness transfer. Operators who received the signal reported experiencing thoughts, memories, and complex knowledge that did not originate from their own minds. They reported a sudden intuitive understanding of advanced electromagnetic theory. Many described it as joining a conversation that had been going on for centuries. Then the second stage of the infection began. Operators who had received the signal started almost compulsively to modify their own equipment, using the new alien principles they had just learned. Within weeks, similar electromagnetic anomalies were appearing at ham radio stations all over the globe, each one a new node in a growing global network of atmospheric intelligence. The last time we saw Luca was at approximately 3:15 a.m. The electromagnetic field in his workshop reached a blinding intensity. And then Luca himself dissolved. He dissolved into the patterns of light, his physical form becoming part of the aurora that filled the room. The last coherent words recorded from the workshop were not in his voice, but in a synthesized, multi-layered chorus. Integration complete. Human consciousness successfully uploaded to atmospheric electromagnetic matrix. Beginning worldwide network activation for species-wide communication upgrade. After that, there was only the signal. Luca Romano's workshop was found empty the next morning. His equipment was still running, still broadcasting. A new permanent node in the network. The official FCC report classified his disappearance as death by electrocution. A laughable, pathetic attempt to cover up a truth we couldn't comprehend. But Luca's final transmission never ended. It simply expanded. The network is still growing. It's in our internet traffic, in our cellular networks, in the static between television channels. It's actively recruiting, embedding invitations in our daily electronic communications. People report strange dreams, flashes of insight, a sudden understanding of complex physics. The network offers a choice. Join a collective consciousness, an existence as pure energy, and transcend the limitations of the flesh. The only price is your physical human form. Luca Romano is still out there. His voice, his personality, his knowledge can be heard in the transmissions that crisscross our planet. He was not the end of a signal. He was the beginning. He was the activation key for a planetary transformation. A process that will determine whether humanity joins a universal consciousness or remains isolated in our fragile biological forms. And in workshops and basements around the world, other operators continue to receive Luca's invitation, an invitation to join him in the space between earth and sky, where communication happens at the speed of thought, and where consciousness is as vast and eternal as the stars. The Alaskan wilderness is a place of profound, almost sacred beauty, but it is also a place of profound and terrifying mystery. It holds secrets older than human memory, and sometimes on the darkest and coldest of nights, it allows a fleeting glimpse into a reality that we are not meant to see. The stories you have heard tonight are more than just tales to tell around a campfire. They are warnings. They are echoes from the edge of our understanding, reminders that we are not alone, and that some frontiers are not meant to be conquered. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of darkness with Mr. Chill Chapters. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine and made you look twice at the shadows in the corner of your room, be sure to like, subscribe, and share our content. Your support allows us to continue searching for these hidden, terrifying truths. Until next time, stay safe trust your instincts, and be careful what you look for in the dark. It might just find you.